thank you guys all for being here tonight. This is, we've done a really nice job with America's 250 here in Reading. This is our third event, and Charles Ives is a really interesting connection to that because, believe it or not, like he lived on Umpawaug Hill, and just across the way from him was where General Israel Putnam stayed during the Revolutionary War. So it ties things together really nice. And so what we're going to do for you tonight is give you a lot of background on the family, what Charles Ives was, not only as a composer, but also as a Reading resident, and what he did for the insurance industry, which is pretty remarkable, and then his music. And that's where, Suzanne is like really gonna like blow your minds after we talk. But I've been.
Thank the Lord, because we know nothing about music. I grew up on rap music, so there's that. I think it's a cool connection to our overall demographic or region. Obviously, the homestead is in Danbury. Ives now is a bank named after them, and there's a museum there that Danbury has. So hopefully we'll do a good job as we normally do, and it's all organic. Between Bruce and I, we talk about things, but we don't really hone in on a specific way we're going to go about it. So hope you guys enjoy tonight. I'll control the computer. He'll be in his director's chair, and we'll have some fun. Okay, Charles Ives came from a pretty prominent Danbury family. His grandfather started the bank, savings bank of Danbury, and he actually started in it. This is the Homestead House. The Homestead House is still in existence. It was moved to Mountainville Road by the Danbury Historical Society. And it's sitting there. I don't know how often it's open, but there is a sign out there that it's the original Homestead House. But his grandfather started the bank in that house, and you can barely see to the right of that another bank building, and that is the current Savings Bank of Danbury, which is now called the Ives Bank. Behind that house sat the original, no, not the original, but the second Congregational Church in Danbury, and that burned in 1908 or 1909. So he had church music coming from the back of his, right in the back of his house. And when Charles Ives was growing up, he would sit in the front porch and he would listen to his father, who was a band leader. He'd be playing down in Elwood Park, which was about a quarter mile south on Main Street from there, and then he'd hear church music in the background. And when he started to write music, he mixed a lot of the things that he heard, and so his music's a little different than most people write music. Charles Ives' father, George, was probably the only Ives family member who really didn't have a great business acumen, and he had no desire to. He just wanted to play music. His grandfather started a bank. His grandfather's brother, who was Isaac White Ives, he had a lumber yard on White Street, about where Leahy's is today. And both George and Isaac, their middle name was White because their mother's maiden name was White. And that's where you get White Street, from that family in Danbury. So I said they're a prominent family in that thing. George Edward Ives, which is Charles's father, was born in 1845, and he was in the Civil War, and all he did in the Civil War was play music and was a band leader, and that's what he liked to do. And when he got out of the Civil War, he had to feed himself, but he really wasn't interested in working, and he worked as a teller at his father's bank. He didn't really get much further than that. Get the next slide. Mary Elizabeth Parmalee Ives. She was born in Reading. She was Noah and Mary Parmalee's daughter. Noah was a tailor, and he lived on Poverty Hollow Road near the Newtown border. And I'm just thinking, it's a kind of a strange place for a tailor, but when you think about it, he never ran out of buttons. Because all the button factories and stuff that were in the valley, 3 button factories. But she was a native of Reading, Her father died relatively young, so her mother and her, I think she had 6 or 7 siblings, they ended up moving to Danbury, which is where they would have, where she would have met George Edward Ives.
No, that's true. Like, so if you go to Newtown, there's Parmley Hill, which probably ties to the close connection. And Mary Elizabeth was a very popular combination of the name. So, but her nickname was Molly.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. Charles Ives began composing at the age of 13. By 14, he was the youngest paid organist in the state of Connecticut. Don't know where he played the organ, but I'm guessing he might have been in the Congregational Church behind it. But it also could have been, there was like 3 or 4 churches, the Methodist Church, St. James Church, St. Peter Church. They were all within very short walking distance. Did you know?
I think it was Danbury Baptist Church, actually.
Danbury Baptist Church. Where is that? That one I don't know where it is.
I think that I might be incorrect, but I'm pretty sure that's accurate.
Well, I said we couldn't find out where, exactly which church it was, but I said at 14 is pretty young to be doing that. He started to write songs and different pieces at that age, and he liked to put things like church bells, the gong from the fire department. The gong from the fire department was right up on the hill right behind his house. Whenever there was a fire in Danbury, they went out and it was a great big gong, and they just banged on the thing and rang the thing. He would add things like that to his music. It was kind of whimsical, not the typical classical musician that you would expect.
yeah, he was totally just different from the time. And I think that really ties to, probably his dad. His dad was different than most, and think about it, like my dad was into adult softball and football, and guess what I was good at? So it's just, I think it's just a nature nurture thing. I like this one because you can still see those pillars today.
Yeah. The pillars are the only thing else. This is Brookside Park. Brookside Park was developed probably in the 1850s, and it was primarily a Methodist religious camp that they had there. It took up about 30 acres. This is right next to these pillars are right next to the current West Reading post office. The pillars, the bottom parts of the pillars are the only things that are left. This camp supposedly had the first electric generator in Connecticut, and I always, when anybody says supposedly had it, it makes me wonder how accurate that statement is, but it was in 1874. They had electric lights there. So it would have been a acetylene generator at the time. They would have made the gasoline to then, the acetylene gas to light up the place during the winter or night time. George Ives conducted at the pavilion. This map was done by the late Charlie Couch, who preceded us as a town historian. And Charlie did a lot of research on this, and this is not necessarily accurate, but it probably is. From everything that we've read, all of these things existed within the park, and so we'll take this as being close enough. Right? Charles was inspired to write his 3rd symphony by attending these Methodist camp meetings, and one of the movements in that was called the camp meeting. Go on.
Yeah, because if you think about it, we had the railroad come through here in 1852. So what that allowed people to do was to come out of the city and come to places like ours. So the earliest railroad in Connecticut was through the Housatonic, which was 1842. We were 1852. So that brought people up into our region. And then places like this became very popular. Believe it or not, before we had things like this and railroads, people, were looking for open spaces, and they would go to graveyards to hang out in green spaces. Yeah. So it just kind of gives you a tell. And an article written by Bruce about people moving from the cities into the countries, once railroads were available, was very telling, because if you think about it, like the cities, like we'll say Bridgeport or New Haven or Norwalk even, like we're dirty with noise, sound, and
dirt roads, so the traffic as it went by people's houses. The women at the time had a terrible time keeping their curtains clean in the summertime because there was no air conditioning, so they had they had it open to get fresh air, and dirt was coming in constantly.
Yeah, and then once you bring in the trains, like it gets even worse.
Yeah, you had trains, you had streetcars, you had a lot of clanging going on.
So this became like the best place that they could come and be a part of the country, so to speak. And that's where you get the draw of people coming to our area, Mark Twain included. He came up here from New York City, and everyone else did the same thing. Whether you lived here in the summer or you brought your family here for the summer and you worked down in New York City. This kind of environment that was like you had music, you had a pond, you had relaxation. That's where Brookside Place really came into play. Across the street, they ended up building a hotel.
Yeah, they had a hotel there for a while, but also the railroad ended up buying this park probably in the 1880s. Something like that. Railroads at that time, once everybody got into the railroad business, and there was railroads going every which way. The first came out, the railroads made a lot of money because they didn't have a lot of competition. Once they got into the 1880s, the 1890s, there was a tremendous amount of competition, and all of a sudden, with all that competition, they had lower rates for freight, they had lower rates for passengers, and they needed to get more passengers. Railroads and streetcar companies would build parks or buy parks just to have a destination to bring people to them during the day or during the weekends in particular. The Kenosha Park in Danbury, that was owned by the streetcar company in Danbury. They ran a streetcar line out there. There was nothing else out there except that park. But they said they ran that for a number of years that way. And that went on until the early 1900s when the railroads started to really be really squeezed for money. And towns found out that they could charge property taxes to railroads, and that really put the kibosh on most railroads.
Yeah.
So they all sort of had to merge together, otherwise they would go out of business.
Yeah, but the big thing, like for our region, was that obviously we were one of the first, and what they did, which was really smart, was that down in Norwalk, South Norwalk, they built a place on Wilson's Point, is what it was called. So what they would do is they would take the trains and they put them on boats, and they would go across to Long Island, because Long Island at that moment in time wasn't very, it wasn't Long Island as we know it today. So you could take a boat across the Sound, like we take the Port Jeff Ferry, and then you would hook up to their lines, and you would bypass all the bottleneck that heads into New York City. So that's why we became like so popular just before 1900, and that's why like Gilbert and Bennett did well, because of the same, like we were on the same line. So people were coming up here from not only South Fairfield County, but Long Island, and but that's really the neat thing about where we live is like we're kind of like a microcosm of industry, transportation, and public life. Ives, and so Hopkins School, I was really impressed with Hopkins. Hopkins School was established in 1660, and then he goes on to Yale. There's a connection between Hopkins School and a woman named Anna Yale. Eli Yale was the man that is connected with Yale University, and that was her nephew.
You can see in this picture, Ives is to the left, and he's a pretty good looking young man. He was the pitcher there. Danbury at the time didn't have a high school, so he went to high school in New Haven. And they said after he got out of there in 1894, he enrolled at Yale. At Yale, his nickname called him Dasher. His colleagues called him Dasher. He was one of the better liked students on campus. He joined a lot of clubs, played a lot of intramural sports, spent a lot of time playing piano in vaudeville theaters, any place he could get a job. He wrote a couple of songs. He did this March number 6 while he was at Yale, and he wrote Here's to Good Old Yale, and then he wrote a sentimental tune for the Glee Club called The Bells of Yale.
In addition to that, he wrote a campaign song for William McKinney. I like this one. Bruce added this. This is like something that was created on Pine Mountain in Ridgefield, and I like it because I grew up on Peaceable Street, and at the top of the CLMP lands, like you can see across the Long Island Sound on certain days. So he had the same thing here, and like Bruce noted, it's almost 30 miles away.
Yeah. On a clear day, you can stand on the top of this hill. I've done it, and look straight across and see Long Island from northern Richfield to northern Danbury. This is what this place looks like today. In the previous picture, Ives is in that picture, so we know that Ives is the one to the far right. And there is another chimney that's on that trail, which is supposedly the cabin. I don't know that he would have had 2 cabins up there. He definitely had this place. But I said, this is just a spectacular spot. You can park on Pine Mountain Road in Ridgefield. If you go to the end, there's a parking lot, and then you can mark the trails from there, or you can attack it if you really don't want to walk from Bennett's Pond. Yeah.
I like this one. I mean, because like if you think about it, like we're a Mark Twain library. Mark Twain and Harmony's dad were best friends. So that they, that is really the weird but cool connection.
Yeah, David Twitchell was one of Charles's classmates, and he introduced his younger sister, Harmony. Interesting name, but Harmony was her mother's maiden name. But they were introduced in 1896. And I was asking Suzanne, because I don't know for sure if they had a really long courtship or what, but it was in June of 1908 when they finally got married. So they knew each other for 12 years before they got married. But I always found one of the most interesting things when I read Twitchell, I said, well, it has to be Joseph Twitchell's son, and it was. They're his children. But Joseph Twitchell was Mark Twain's best friend. They knew each other from the mid-1800s. He baptized all 3 of Mark Twain's children, and he performed the marriage between Clara Clemens and Ossip Gabrilowitz.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. If I say Gabrilowitz, you should say God bless you. In 1909. One of the funniest stories that I saw, and I don't know how much truth there is to it, but in 1874, Samuel Clemens and Joseph Twitchell decided to walk from Hartford to Boston. It's a distance of about 100 miles. They walked for a day, and then they took the train.
No, it's true. They try. I don't know why they even tried. They used to, there's a tower in Simsbury that they used to go to all the time, and but they decided to walk from his house and try to get to Boston, and and it's the old Connecticut path, so it's the original pathway that the settlers from Massachusetts, Bay Colony, came here. But there's a really funny, Yale University has some archives, Beinecke Library. Beinecke. And there's it's a really funny set of pictures of them soaking their feet that were burning hot in attempting it. But they jumped on a train. That was that. But there's some really funny correspondence between him and his wife Libby about that. It's a classic story.
But Harmony was trained, as you can see, she's wearing a nurse's uniform there, so she's trained as a nurse.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really the interesting thing about the relationship is that you have a composer that marries a woman named Harmony.
In 1907, Charles Ives teamed up with Julian Myrick, and they began representing the Mutual Life Insurance Company in New York. They specialized in life insurance and estate planning. Estate planning, that's really early. Within 2 years, these 2 guys were producing $2 million a year in revenue for New York Mutual Life. By 1929, they were producing $26 million worth of business. They were doing extremely well.
That's
And
like $500 million a day.
Yeah, this is one of the ads, earliest ads I found. I think this ad is from 1911 that I found.
Yeah, they
in
kind
the
of
New
need
York
like
Times.
they needed chat GPT to clean that one up.
Yeah.
Death row wage.
In 1912, Ives came to Reading and he bought a piece of property on Umpawaug Road and he built this particular house. This is supposed to be the summer house for him and Harmony, and they had an adopted daughter named Edith. By the early 1920s, he was making so much money that he could afford to spend a little bit more time in the country, but he became a regular commuter. Became his main house. He still kept an apartment in New York, but most of the time he commuted by train on a daily basis to his insurance offices when he went in New York City.
Yep, and he rode a horse named Rocket. So Rocket would go from the top of Umpawaug Hill down to the station.
He did eventually buy a car.
He did eventually buy a
really
Model
sprung
T.
for all expensive car.
But he was really not happy about the improvements of the road, as we all are.
Yes. I want to hear that horse story. Did he leave his horse at the station all day, or like what happened to the horse during the day? So I was curious.
We don't know, like that's just.
He probably walked home.
Maybe
Of course,
that's
it's
what
hard.
Well, that is the truth, like Bruce said, like Bruce, I always asked my grandfather about horses and like when we went into like automobile, era trucks. And I said, Grandpa, like why didn't people just have trucks? And he's like, because Michael, the horses knew the way. So they would go to each stop. So like you could have a new employee, say you're delivering fish or meat. Like they would just put the guy in the truck with the milk, fish, or meat, and the horse would just deliver the guy to where he needed to be. And he just and that was the way it was.
Well,
So,
particularly
Designated
designated ice, where they were delivering pretty much on a daily basis, because milk didn't keep until you had refrigerators. People had to get milk on a daily basis.
but yeah, that was the thing. But like Bruce, like this is another thing that Bruce brought up. Like people that lived in Reading, because we had the railroad.
The train made the big difference, because West Reading had by far the most number of summer residents, and summer residents of a lot of means that came here. And this is just some of the ones that we picked out, and these are people who lived here when Ives was living here. There's a lot more people that lived later and before and after. But on this particular map, you've got Ives Studios, number 1. Number 2 is Catherine Dreyer. She was an artist. She loved modern art. She was one of the ones that started the Modern Museum of Art.
Was she the one who was friends with Duchamp and had a lot of his stuff?
Friends with who?
Duchamp?
I think so.
I mean, she was like his patron or matron.
Yeah, she lived on Marchant Road to start with, and then she built this humongous house off of Long Ridge, and it's right behind the Long Ridge Congregational Church. And but it's multi-winged. It looks almost like it's a museum or an art gallery. But then you had Edward Steichen, who also moved there in the 1920s. He bought a farm on Topstone, and he called it Umpawaug Farm. He built a house there in 1928 or 29. He lived in that house for about 10 years, and they built a really cool modern house, which sits on a lake that he built. And one of the cool things about Steichen is that his brother-in-law was the poet Carl Sandburg. Carl Sandburg spent a lot of time in Reading, and he used to come and they used to grow, I think, dahlias, but I'm not sure. They were big flower.
Yeah, you'll see pictures online of him
They sold their own seed
Yeah.
for a while. And then number 4 and number 5, this is the same house. It's on the corner of 70 Acres Road in Umpawaug. The first woman that lived there was named Marjorie Doig, and she was an aviatrix, and she flew in the very first powder puff derby. She bought her own airplane, a remarkable woman, because she learned how to fly in about 6 weeks, decided she wanted her own plane. She talked her instructor into flying her to Ohio, where she purchased an airplane and flew it home. Within 4 more weeks, she entered her first competition in Erie, Pennsylvania. She flew there. Within another 7 or 8 weeks, she decided there was a new, just for women only, they were going to fly a competition, timed competition, from Los Angeles to Chicago. she decided she wanted to be in it, so she talked her instructor into going along with her, but they flew her plane in 1930 from Bridgeport, Connecticut to Los Angeles. And then it was, I think, a 5-day competition, and she ended up finishing in second place. But one day she landed and she blew a tire and broke a strut. Another day she took off and the engine caught on fire and the engine was destroyed, and she had to land the plane and wait 2 days until a new engine arrived. And Brent and I were talking about this before. But, you know, they didn't have Venmo.
They didn't have Venmo like that.
I don't know how she paid for it. You know, she must have had a big sack of cash, I guess. But it's a really interesting woman.
No, for the older ones among us, it was like Cannonball Run, but with like a plane.
Yeah, kind of. And then the next occupant of that house was a man named Walter White. And Walter White was one of the, he ran the NAACP. And it's very interesting because he was married to a white woman who came from South Africa. And you can't think of any country that's probably more racist than South Africa was with our yeah, okay. I need a Scotch Brent, you know. But he was married to Poppy Cannon. Poppy Cannon was a magazine editor, and another interesting thing about Poppy is Poppy was the very first TV chef. She had a segment on the Today Show in 1953 where she actually cooked some stuff. And there's some of you here that are old enough to remember the Today Show and remember Dave Garroway with his little bow tie and his hard-rimmed glasses, and J. Fred Muggs, his pal, pet chimpanzee, who was on the show. So it's pretty hilarious. It's supposed to be a news show with a chimpanzee leading the group, which probably is about right. You know, and house number 6 is Albert Bigelow Paine, who was an author, and he wrote Twain's biography, and he's the guy that convinced Twain to come to Reading in the first place.
Yeah, he needed like Twain to come here so he could focus.
So he could stay here instead of, he liked living where his house has since burned down. That stone wall and the steps, I think, are still there. It's about halfway on right here on Diamond Hill between Umpawaug and.
It's just out of Jen's house on the left.
Oh, okay. And then you got number 7, Dan Beard, who's right across the street on Great Pasture. And he was an illustrator. He illustrated a couple of Twain's books, and he was also one of the founders of the Boy Scouts. And then number 8 is Elsie Hill, who was a suffragette, and she lived on 70 Acres Road when it was nothing much more than a cow path.
Yeah.
But interesting group of neighbors.
No doubt. The studio is cool. I mean, you can see why he really liked to be here. You know, he really liked the common space, and you know, as an insurance executive, you know, this is basically where he came home to, and I think what's really interesting is just the, you know, we kind of overlooked the insurance portion of his life, but he was very important in that industry as a whole, because at that moment in time, you know, the Revenue Act of 1916 really kind of enabled him to, you know, become, you know, very wealthy because of, you know, what it said. He actually wrote a book soon after that to tell people exactly like how to do it and what to do.
Well, they had a federal estate tax that was established in 1916 by this act, and it was a $50,000 exemption, and anything over $50,000, your heirs paid 10% of what your net value of the estate. And it quickly went from 10% to 25% to 50%, and it went as high as 80%. So a lot of heirs, if you had a big estate, you didn't walk away with very much money. And the other problem was, in order to inherit a lot of this estate, especially if it was real estate and stuff like that, you had to pay the tax before you took title to the properties. So this was very, very difficult because you couldn't sell the properties to raise the money because you didn't have title to the properties. So Ives was a brilliant guy. He wrote this book, Life Insurance in Relation to the Inheritance Tax. It was, I think every accountant in the country bought it because they then plan for estates for people who were wealthy, so that they wouldn't have to pay this outrageous property tax or inheritance tax.
Yeah.
And by this, if you look at this just happens to be a passport application from 1924. By the mid-1920s, he was making so much money in the insurance business. Obviously, if you're selling $20 million worth of insurance a year between you and your partner, you're doing quite well. But this is one of his passport application for that year. And that year, he and his wife and daughter, they spent the summer in Europe. I kind of love this. He wrote another book in 1920 called Essays Before Sonata. This one, I got to read this one because this gives his sense of humor and his, the fact that he knew that his music was not well accepted at that time. Matter of fact, it really hadn't been played nationally at that time at all. But he says, these essays were written by the composer for those who can't stand his music. And the music for those who can't stand his essays. To those who can't stand either, the whole is respectively dedicated. So I think that was just shows a really good sense of humor. Studio in Reading was full of clutter. And it's really interesting because he ended up leaving his studio just the way when he died. Nobody touched his studio. Nobody touched his studio he died in 1954, and in 2012 the studio was just like he left it. His grandson ended up inheriting the house. His grandson was named Charles Ives Tyler, and when he decided to sell the house in 2012, he ended up donating the entire studio to, tell me again, because I can't
The
remember.
American Academy of Arts and Letters.
Okay. And they then came in and cataloged the entire studio. They took photographs of the entire studio, exactly where everything is. And then they made it so that they could replicate it when they moved everything to New York to open an exhibit. They even took pictures through the windows to look outside to see what the countryside looked like. And then they blew up the pictures and they put it behind false windows inside of it. You swear when you walk into that thing, you're in the studio. It's a really remarkable exhibit.
No, it's true, and I think that I remember like reading one of the first individuals that looked at his, what was left. He thought it was really interesting that like he had really organized his compositions really well, but over the course of time, I guess he was looking for stuff just like any one of our historians do. So he would pull out certain pieces and look at them, and then he'd put it back on top. So it was like this weird layering of stuff that used to be organized that was no longer organized at all. But I totally get that.
He was constantly tweaking his music. So, I mean, he would write something in 1911 and be working on it in 1933. I mean, just kind of, because it was never, because it wasn't published, and a lot of people had played it, it wasn't stuff that was, when you listen to it, it's not a tune you can carry in your head anyway. But he would do music the way he wanted to do it, and he would constantly work on his music throughout his life. 1928 is really funny because if you live in Reading and you've ever been up the early part of Umpawaug Road, you notice it's fairly wide for a country road. That's because the state maintained that road in the 1920s. They maintained 2 or 3 roads. They maintained Newtown Turnpike. They maintained Cross Highway. They maintained Meeker Hill Road. They maintained part of Umpawaug Road. So the road's a little wider and a little bit better built than most of the roads, rural roads in Reading. But in 1928, the state decided they wanted to pave Umpawaug Road. So they paved it right by his house, and he lived right on almost at the peak of the hill. And he did not like the speed. And he bitched and moaned and complained to everybody that would listen to him for years how much he hated it. He used to shake his fist and airplanes flew over, and that's the time Marjorie Doig was living right down the street from her, had her own airplane. I'm sure she flew over her own house a few times, fairly low, and he's probably up there going, airplanes.
Well, yeah, no, it's true. I mean, Umpawaug is our oldest road here in town. The oldest deed that we've seen is Umpawaug, and that's 1886, because from Norwalk to Danbury, that was how we got there. So from the Sound to Danbury, that was Umpawaug Road. So But I totally get it. I mean, I always, whenever I come here, I do Topstone, I do Umpawaug. I'm kind of blown away by the traffic on Umpawaug too.
His declining health led him to retire in 1930, so he was only in his 50s when he retired. And Suzanne just told us tonight that, you know, I had heard that he had heart murmurs and maybe had arrhythmia, and she said that he suffered from diabetes and was one of the earlier people to be treated for that particular disease. So that may be why he decided to retire at that particular time. But his music hadn't been well played, well accepted through much of his life. It wasn't until 1930 when conductor Nicholas Slonimsky, okay, the Boston Chamber Symphony Orchestra, or Boston Chamber Orchestra, played 3 places in New England on the radio in 1930. That's the first time it was really introduced nationally to the public.
And then Leonard Bernstein really blew him up in like 1951. And Leonard Bernstein lived on Fox Run.
Not at the same time.
No, not at the same time, but yeah, he actually, and I think Charles was, believe it or not, being that rich, he didn't have a radio, but he went to a neighbor's house and he listened to it, and I think he was pretty impressed.
I would think so. Yeah, they go to the next one, because that is the next one, I think. Yeah, and it's, I like what he wrote about this at the time. He goes, there's not much to say about the symphony. He says, I expressed the musical feelings of Connecticut country in the 1890s. It's full of tunes they sang and played then, and I thought it would be sort of a joke to have some of these tunes in a counterpoint to some Bach-like tunes. So that was kind of the end of his career. He died 3 years after this, and he was pretty sick the last 2 or 3 years or so of his life. So that's our portion of it, and now it's Suzanne's turn to tell you about his music.
Okay.
You want this, Jerry?
So thank you all for coming. So tonight, in talking about music, I'm going to really focus on the piece 3 Places in New England, because that's going to be performed on your May 30th concert. And it's so typical of so much of Ives. That is the piece that was performed in 1930 by Slonimsky and the Boston Chamber Orchestra, which was made up of members of the Boston Symphony. This piece, the formal title of it is Orchestral Set Number 1, 3 Places in New England. And it's composed of 3 separate pieces that are combined together. So in a sense, it's like a symphonic work. But Ives had decided to move away from the classical form of the symphony, and he apparently created the orchestral set, and he composed about 7 or 8 of these. The 3 movements all have to do with very specific things. The first movement is called, the parenthetical titles are how it was first titled, and then the rest of it is the current title of the work. So the first is Impression of the St. Gaudens on Boston Common, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw and his Colored Regiment. So I suppose you probably know Augustus St. Gaudens was an American sculptor, very famous. And what we are seeing here is a bas-relief that is actually a mock-up for the bronze sculpture that is still at Boston Common today. Colonel Shaw was the commander of, I think, I'm going to forget the number, somewhere in the 54th, great, thank you, Massachusetts Regiment, which was an all-black regiment. But he was a white man, and he led them down to South Carolina, and they were at the Battle of Fort Wagner in 1863. And half the regiment was killed, and Colonel Shaw himself was killed. So this monument was put up in Boston in his memory, and Ives' piece is an elegy to Shaw and the members of that regiment. Second movement, the bottom picture I expect you all recognize. General Putnam. And this is titled Children's Day at Putnam's Camp. And the third movement, the upper right picture, the Housatonic at Stockbridge. That was a place that was really important to Ives and Harmony. They visited that place on their honeymoon and later went back for a weekend just to spend a lot of time there. So these pieces are really grounded in actual places that Ives knew and had seen, and things that were significant to him. Things like the Civil War. His father was the youngest band leader in the Union Army, and there's a photograph of him at the age of 16 at Cold Harbor outside Richmond on the James River. So, you know, he was, you say he didn't fight, thank God. He was only 16. Playing the trumpet was certainly enough. He must have witnessed horrible things. I don't know, he might have been at the Siege of Petersburg as well. I know the Connecticut Heavy Artillery was in Petersburg. My husband's great-great-grandfather was in that regiment. The Civil War, we also know he would use popular songs, he'll quote classical music. He was very well educated. He got a Bachelor of Music at Yale, and at the time, Horatio Parker, the dean of the school, thought that anybody, to get a Bachelor of Music at Yale, you needed first to get a Bachelor of Arts degree, and then an extra year, you could have a Bachelor of Music. So he also thought that to get a Bachelor of Music, you should be able to write your own concerto and perform it. So Ives' First Symphony was written as his degree piece. I will also say that Ives did come to public notice as a teenager. He wrote a march called the Intercollegiate March when he was 16, and it was performed at the inaugurational parade of President McKinley. So,
I told you at the beginning, Brent, I don't know anything about it.
so part of my job for the last 33 years was working at the Yale Music Library, and I retired in March, and one of my roles there was to help researchers use the Charles Ives papers. There are a lot of records at Yale relating to Charles Ives, and so I've had 30 years to learn about Ives, meeting researchers who've come through, eventually becoming part of the Ives Society Board of Directors, which really is just that. The Ives Society is just this board of directors. We meet once a year. We hand out money, we publish the Ives edition, and I talk about the researchers who come to you. That's my role. Okay, so let's go on. The first two techniques I want to talk about are borrowed tunes, and in the first movement, the St. Gaudens, again, remember this regiment fighting in the Civil War. Old Black Joe, Masses on the Cold Ground by Stephen Foster are some of the songs you hear, as well as the Battle Cry of Freedom, Marching Through Georgia. There are half dozen or so songs, but it's very hard to pick those tunes out. And that's because Ives is using just fragments of these tunes. And in some places, the tunes are very similar. So one scholar has described this kind of movement as a patchwork piece. Practically the whole piece of music is quotes from songs, but you would never know it to hear it. How many of you know the song Old Black Joe? Not a few. Okay, so the refrain goes, I'm coming, for my head is bending low. That's one of the more recognizable parts of this piece. So I'm going to start with the beginning. This is an elegy to the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, and so it's a very slow, somber piece. And you hear the drum, the muffled drum beat. You hear feel the march of the soldiers in it. Let's see. Oops, sorry. Now how do I go back?
It's good.
Is it a shift? Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Alt tab. Well, this is a.
Brent, you know how to make this thing back up?
Oh wait, there's bound to be a back.
You should,
Oh, here it is. Okay.
He's got it.
All right. Should have tried that first. Okay. So this is most of this movement is going to be soft and slow like this. And you hear this minor third, descending minor third, repeated over and over. Sorry for the abrupt cutoffs. I'm kind of new to making clips. Now the second quote excerpt here is where a place where the music is getting louder. I think it's approaching the idea of battle, and the marching is even stronger. Let's see. Oops. This one. Oops. Did that again. I have to point to it, but it's
One down.
there. Gets quiet again. Finally, this is near the end. So this is from the Battle Cry of Freedom. Now this is old lecture. Okay. And so you'll notice the music is very dissonant. It's not the tonal harmonies we're accustomed to hearing. And that's because Ives, I think, was so aware of every sound in the world. And his father was not only a band leader, he was an experimentalist. He would put two bands going around the Danbury Green, playing different tunes, and just wait till they were passing each other. And Ives, in the next piece, he wrote a piece called Country Band March, which does that same thing. You hear these two bands passing each other. So sort of you get these mashups of tunes. You might hear traffic noise, bird song, children's games. Oops. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, especially in Putnam's Camp. So Children's Day at Putnam's Camp really has a program to it. First off, you hear the band playing, and a friend of mine said, Ives was a guy who really knew how to write a march. So the march you'll hear at the beginning is a true Ives composition, not a quote. But then you start hearing other things intervening, and kids are running around, birds are singing, people are talking, things are happening. So let's start the beginning of this, and that goes, let's see. First march. and over to the site of Putnam's camp, hoping to meet an old soldier, perhaps. I don't know, an old Civil War soldier.
He's hoping to find Philip in his cave.
And he gets tired, he falls asleep, and he has a dream, and then suddenly the goddess of liberty is there, exhorting the soldiers not to leave, not to give up.
Dessert.
Yes. Well, you know, they were there over the winter. It would have been hard to stay. They probably didn't have a lot to eat. Their families needed them. So she's, and then they all come together. And so let's hear a little bit of that. I'm gonna make sure I get the right, here we go. So here he is. And the third part, the soldiers come together, they really start marching on. Eventually the boy wakes up and he hears the noise of the Children's Day going on and he leaves. So you'll hear just the end of the dream sequence. Marching away. Now it's back to Children's Day. And the final thing I want to talk about is rhythmic complexity. So I did mean to mention that part of the whole band thing is that members sometimes get off the beat, they get onto the wrong notes, and choirs sing out of tune, and Ives loves to incorporate things like that in his music as well. So wrong notes are probably, as you wrote in one piece, the 4th of July, "Dear Mr. Price, don't try to make things nice. Mr. Price was his copyist. All the wrong notes are right." So, and I also wanted to quote Bernard Herrmann, the great film composer, you know, who composed the scores for Hitchcock's Vertigo and Psycho. Is that it? Psycho, yes. He was an admirer of Ives. He conducted some of the Ives music in New York. And in an interview that we have at Yale, he said he thought Ives was composing snapshots in sound. And this has stayed with me ever since I read that, and I think it helps me to understand the music a little better. So the rhythmic complexity, let's say you've got a beat going like this, and then you've got 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and another instrument is playing 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and maybe another one is going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then yet another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you can imagine this could sound very chaotic. But in the Housatonic at Stockbridge, it ends up sounding ethereal. Ives and his wife were walking alongside the river on a Sunday morning. The mist was rising. The river was flowing, probably softly in the background. And across the river and in the middle of a field, there was a church, and they could hear the choir, the sound of the choir coming across the fields and over the river. So it's this misty, ethereal sound. There are 2 hymn tunes quoted, and you'll hear both of them in the first example here. One is Tunes of hymns have names, just as the texts have titles. Most of us refer to hymns in terms of the titles of the texts, or the first line of the text, or the refrain of the text. But the tunes themselves, because hymns can be sung to lots of different tunes, tunes have their own names, so you can be sure you're talking about the same tune. The two tunes in this are called Dornance and Missionary Chant, neither of which was a tune that I knew. So they're pretty old ones, but you'll hear them pretty clearly in this piece, and especially the second, because there's quite an extended paraphrase of that tune. So again, all this rhythmic complexity, but it doesn't sound like it. Then Ives imagines the waters of the river flowing to their mouth, not emptying into the ocean, but as we in Connecticut know, Long Island Sound. Eventually, though, those waters and the Sound's waters mingle and reach the ocean. So there is a brief moment where things get a little noisier. Oh, shoot, how does this keep happening to me? All right, there. That's the end of it. That's an unusual ending to a piece. On your handout, I have credits for the images, the recording that you've been listening to. There are 4 versions of this piece. Ives conceived of it for full orchestra, but the chamber orchestra is a smaller ensemble. So he reworked it, he cut some pieces of paper out, and that's version 2. And then after a revision with Nicholas Solimsky editing, he publishes that. There's version 3, again for chamber orchestra. And then James Sinclair, who's conducting the recording you just heard while he was a graduate student, recreated the full orchestral version. There was a lot remaining of the full version, but he had to, I think, fill in a couple of lines. The Ives Society website has all the borrowed tunes recorded. So if you're not sure what tunes are and you're learning about a piece, you can go there. Lots of other things on the site. Yale has both rare Ives recordings and interviews with people who knew Ives. Musicians, business associates, his neighbors, Babe the barber. And those interviews and the rare recordings are all online, and all you have to do is create an account, click an agreement, submit the form. You'll receive an email almost instantaneously And you can then just listen to those online from wherever you are. And finally, a few books, several of which you have here in the library. There's even more, I added a couple to the handout. So thank you so much for your attention.